Enquanto você ouve suas músicas e podcasts favoritos, deixa eu te perguntar, você já sabe da novidade do ano? Chegou a nova Fiat Titano. A nova picape da Fiat faz bonito nos terrenos mais desafiadores. Performance com motor turbo diesel 4x4 e câmera 360 graus off-road, que ajudam você a ultrapassar qualquer obstáculo. Sem falar que ela tem a maior caçamba da categoria. Tá esperando o que para conhecer? Nova Fiat Titano, chegou a sua vez de fazer história. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Before I get to today's show, I wanted to let everyone know that we experienced a few issues with audio quality. We didn't notice them when we were recording the show, but when I started to do the post-production, they became apparent. I did my best to clean them up, but there are still a few artifacts here and there. We're working on the issue, and I think I have a solution, so this should just be a temporary one-time thing, but I just wanted to let you know. With me today for our regular weekly news analysis show is my co-host, attorney, and Republican strategist, Jay Carson. You know, before we get started, Jay, I think we know how everyone feels about ads, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Love them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, well, some people might be disappointed, but I'm betting a few more people will be happy to hear that this episode is going to be ad-free. Now, of course, if you'd like to hear more ad-free episodes of the Politics Guys, there's something you can do to help us out. We hope you'll consider supporting the show by going to politicsguys.com and clicking on the Patreon link you'll find there. Thanks so much for your support. Okay, and now on to our first story. Let's open this week, Jay, with FCC Chair Ajit Pai's announcement that the agency will be voting on a repeal of the net neutrality rules that were put into place by the Obama administration back in 2015. Now, the vote won't be until December 14th, but honestly, it's little more than a formality since the other two Republicans on that five-person panel are almost certainly going to be joining the chairman. So this is, I think, pretty much a done deal, I'd say, at this point. Would you agree?
I'd agree, yes.
Yeah. And, so Pai and the other folks who are in favor of this are essentially calling it a return to the pre-2015 status quo. But actually, if you look at the proposal, it's more sweeping than they're portraying it to be because it would essentially reverse FCC rulings prohibiting providers from blocking and throttling certain services. And these are rulings that actually date back to 2005. Now, of course, Comcast, AT&T, big service providers like that, and by the way, Verizon, where incidentally Pai previously worked as an attorney. Now, they see this, right? They're characterizing this as a corrective against what's been called heavy-handed rules that have kind of squelched investment. Now, that's kind of a strange argument to me, since SEC filings show that investments are actually up since 2015 when this supposedly awful onerous regulation went into effect. Now, on the other side, you have opponents like big tech companies like Facebook, Google, and Netflix, and all sorts of small businesses who worry that they won't be able to compete with big companies that can afford preferential treatment. And also, I should point out, the public's very much opposed. Support for net neutrality is both overwhelming and bipartisan. In a recent poll, around 3/4 of all Americans were in favor of keeping net neutrality, and that's with 81% of Democrats in favor and 73% of Republicans in favor. So, Jay, what's your position on this?
Well, my position doesn't matter, but I would say I think the more conservative position. And first of all, I'd say, if you look at the public outcry over this, I think the big piece of it is that this is a difficult issue to understand. It's not exactly clear what it'll do. And look, to me, this is the perfect example of, essentially government rent seeking, and it ought to trouble more people the more they understand this. And this is also an example of every time the government acts to create some sort of a benefit for some group, a tremendous lobby will spring up to protect that benefit at all costs. And in this case, the benefit that the net neutrality rules from 2015 have put in advantage those companies like Netflix and Amazon that provide a lot of streaming services And because it requires the cable companies, the transmitters, to send those programs, if you will, at the same rate that it does other data, other websites. Even though those programs take up a lot more bandwidth of what they're providing. So, and to me, and again, the analogy I would use, and I would say, look, the 2015 thing, I mean, I think that's important because I do think this is different from a status quo. And we can right. I don't think the status quo, if we were to go back to the pre-2015, would be that terrible. Most people had a fine internet experience then, and I agree things need to change because of what's happening now with more streaming. But that to me is all the more reason why you don't want net neutrality. And I think a lot of the smart people who were would benefit from this got ahead early by coining the phrase net neutrality, because who doesn't want neutrality, right? Who doesn't want everybody to be treated equal? That sounds really nice. But let me think of it this way. Say you are shipping, because it's the Christmas season or the whatever pagan solstice fest you guys celebrate, and you want to ship something to someone across the country. If you go to UPS, they will charge you based on how much that package weighs, how big the package is, and how soon you need to get it there. So if you need to ship a couch across the country and you want it there the next day, you're going to pay a premium for that. If you're just sending someone a gift card and it can be there in the next 2 or 3 days, you're going to pay substantially less. And I think most people would think, geez, that sounds pretty reasonable and fair. Especially if you were, say, Pottery Barn and you're shipping couches across the country and you used to be able to ship it at the same letter rate. So to me, I think people ought to think about it in that framework first. The idea that a transmitter, let's say the UPS company, can charge more to one customer than another, is actually a very pro-consumer situation, because what it creates is you can opt in at whatever tier you want, and the big guys are going to pay more, and that's going to give the transmitter, in this case, the cable companies, or if you continue the UPS analogy, give them incentives to make more investments because they'll make more money, and that to me is what you want at the end is more investment. Now, you cited some figures that said investment was up. I had seen other figures indicating that investment was down. Now, since 2015, now not tremendously. I think the numbers I saw were something like they'd cut investment by like 5% in those years. But I think you compare it not against, are they always making investment? Sure, well, you hope so. But how much bigger would the investment be if they have the ability to monetize the streaming services, which are going to be the next big thing? Sure, and yeah, obviously, and that was necessarily a long answer, because this topic is just something that it's really arcane, and it takes a while to talk about. Sure, absolutely. And I would say on the investment issue, of course, it's always difficult to prove a counterfactual, right? What would an investment have been like otherwise? And we've talked about that in previous episodes with other things. But let me start by saying, well, first off, I disagree with you. But second, you make some important points, and I think these are points that haven't come out. Net neutrality is one of these issues that's become sort of an article of faith or right. A strong thing, especially on the left. And I, in the end, I sympathize and I agree with that position. But I think the point you make is a very important point, and I think it's a very good analogy that you used. And I would, in fact, agree with you. If I didn't think that the internet was different, if I didn't think that your thinking was sort of stuck in the 20th century on this issue. So, and let me explain what I mean. Ouch. Yeah, well, we're 20th century kind of guys. So, but we are. Yeah. But I'm just a little more evolved, I guess. I don't know. But no, here's what I mean.
I think that in a perfect world, or even in a better world, that there would be a lot less government interference, regulation of the internet, but that's not the world we live in. I think that the internet has essentially become the equivalent of, for most Americans, I would say, like a public utility, basically, and almost a necessity, a thing that people depend on like they do electricity and water and so forth. And there's a reason why we have heavy regulation of these industries. A couple of reasons. Number one, that's
essentially what the FCC did in 2015. They declared the internet a public utility.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think there are a couple good reasons for that. One is it's become such a necessary thing for people's lives. I found that out recently when my internet went out and I was, practically lost. But a second reason has to do with something called natural monopolies. Just like it's hugely expensive to string all this cable, to string all this fiber optic wire and so forth. And so what we have is a situation just like with the gas company, the electric company, that sort of thing. You have what are called natural monopolies. And so, I agree with the FCC chairman that ideally what we would have is all we need is transparency. And so let's say, and this is how he's basically been pushing it, saying we're going to have a lot more transparency. And so let's say that Verizon wants to throttle or block certain services. They have to let you know that. And then you can make an informed decision as a consumer. Do I want to stick with Verizon or do I want to go with Comcast or something like that? And that to me would be an ideal situation. But here's the problem. A 2015 study by the FCC found that only 24% of all census blocks had 2 or more broadband providers. Now, competition is a little higher in urban areas, but even then, the number's only 36%. So what that means is in a vast majority of the country, you have broadband monopolies. And so this idea, transparency only works if there's competition. And so I think the focus should be more than anything else on how can government act to ensure or to promote competition? And this doesn't do that.
Amen. You're thinking on the wrong way. Oh,
well, this doesn't do that. But here's something that would do that. What I would love to see a national fiber infrastructure project. I mean, kind of like, the federal interstate highway project in the 1950s, 1960s that had huge positive externalities. It was a great thing for innovation, for business, for everyone, really. I say this is the 21st century.
Led to the white flight that destroyed our cities, led to the soulless suburban landscape.
There were certain negative externalities.
Yada, yada, yeah. Okay.
But I think you would agree that by far that is a positive thing. That is one of the great shining examples of a national public works project
right.
that has.
No, I agree. I'm just messing with it.
Okay.
But yes, but understand there aren't. Consequences.
And absolutely. And here's what I'm saying. Now, a few years back, Goldman Sachs calculated that the cost for Google to take their fiber optic service that they have in a few lucky cities, and that's super fast, it's 1 gigabyte per second. The cost for them to do that for the entire country would be $140 billion. Now, that would be a lot for Google, and they're not going to do that, but that would not be at all that much for a national infrastructure project. And if that was done by the federal government on a nationwide level, then those lines could be leased at a reasonable rate to all sorts of competitors. And then we would see an amazing flowing of innovation and competition. And that, I think, is a great example of a great role for government to step in and to create the conditions where entrepreneurs, where companies can get involved, can compete, and the consumer would benefit in a huge way. Because right now, if you take a look at our broadband service in the United States compared to most other rich developed countries, it stinks. It's expensive. It's slow. And this to me is a great example of, while, I understand the arguments for limited government, this is a great example where government could step in to complement, to increase competition, and to really make a positive difference for consumers around the country.
And it'd be good because the government built it.
Well, see, and that to me, that reflects a sort of anti-government thing. And I know you're just kind of joking.
Yes, of course. and that sort of goes back to, my sense is look, I'm very much in favor of infrastructure, but I think the better way to do it is to create incentives for private companies to improve and build new infrastructure. The other fun thing, that's a little bit funny, I mean, you accuse me of being a 20th century guy. Man, you're still talking about wires and so forth. That's old school. And I think if you think about what we're going to be dealing with in the coming centuries, it's going to be more and more wireless, more and more but regardless, I think the problem is you talk about wanting to incentivize, and I hate that word. I take that back.
Me too.
Create incentives for companies to invest. There's absolutely no incentive if you create a rule that says you can't charge the big customer any more than the small customer. And in fact, the old FCC rule would have allowed the FCC to put in price controls. Now they hadn't. They had sort of held off on doing that. But why would UPS want to change its structure to make it more competitive if at the end of the day it has to just charge the exact same price as FedEx for everyone? I get the natural monopoly argument, but you could make that argument that that's what existed years ago in shipping, right? I mean, you had the U.S. Postal Service, and then you had these sort of outliers who did special business shipping, but now it's taken off. And you have, much more traffic flowing in the private shipping, UPS, FedEx world than you do in the U.S. Post Office, because in large part it's seen as more reliable. That's
Let me just say, I see what you're saying, but I think that you're maybe downplaying a little bit the amount of differentiation that there can be. Like, for instance, certain areas of Cincinnati where I live are fortunate enough to have broadband competition between Cincinnati Bell and Comcast. And in those areas, Cincinnati Bell actually offers a package of services that is a little better, a little less expensive than what Comcast offers. And those two companies can compete on the packages they offer, the sort of for the TV part of it, the TV package, that sort of thing. So there are ways to differentiate services. It isn't all about, this isn't like it's just like we're talking about water or electricity, a thing that is just a thing. There's a lot of ways for there to be real competition. And it doesn't mean that just because you can't charge Netflix more than you charge, some startup, that doesn't mean that there isn't real competition, because there is real competition. In fact, in, a lot of studies, for instance, where Google has come to town, the various towns they've come to and strung their networks, all of a sudden there's been real competition, and there have been prices that have dropped and services that have improved. And so this has been a boon to consumers, and I'd like to see more of it.
Yes. So keep the government out of it.
But that's the problem, is that the government, you can't have that kind of competition because no one's willing to invest all the money in that system. And I think that's a perfect role for government there.
They will invest the money if they can see the return. And I think that's why I think my view, and I think the conservative economic view is one ought to oppose net neutrality, even though it sounds really nice, because doing that will create that incentive to build more and better networks and to make more investment, because they'll make more money.
Two things. First off, number one, you need to work on a different term, because you're right. The net neutrality thing just sounds awful for your side, but I know what you're saying. But second, let me ask you this. One critique of a non-net neutrality internet comes from small businesses, from startups who say, listen, if we can't afford to get preferential treatment, preferential speeds from these ISPs, there's no way we're going to be able to compete with the big companies. And so this is basically just taking the status quo and ensuring that the small handful of deep-pocketed companies are going to dominate the internet, and companies like, now big internet companies like Etsy and other things like that, who started from essentially nothing, said, there's no way we would be able to do what we were able to do if we would have had to pay for decent access. I mean, do you think that's a legitimate concern?
No, because I again, the idea that you would be able to differentiate between the type of streaming, the amount of pipe that's being used, so to speak, for something like Etsy, which certainly has a lot of business, a lot of traffic, but is still way down, in terms of data used compared to something like Netflix. If the traditional website, typical web business, the amount of data that's transferred by that business compared to, again, YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, it's night and day. And so I think, look, if you're talking about, I have a mom and pop startup that wants to have a streaming video business, well, maybe the model is that you create that and start getting buzz and then get bought out by Netflix or Amazon or something like that. I guess that's, regardless, in big media, those are going to be there's always going to be big players, because not only do they have to pay a lot for the access and the delivery, but they have to pay a lot for the content.
Sure.
Either to buy it from some other content provider, movie studios, what have you, or to create it on their own, which now they're doing and having great success at. So
you don't see, from what I'm hearing, you don't see any downside at all to revoking these rules and going back to sort of a pre-2005 situation. No downside at all. Well,
I think to say we're going back to a pre-2005 situation overstates it. A pre-2015 situation, I don't think there's any problem there.
Well, that's the public. That's what they're saying in public. But the fact of the matter is if you read the proposed regulation, it basically, because there have been a series since 2005 of FCC rulings that have essentially said that you're not allowed to engage in throttling or banning of services if you're an ISP.
And the FTC would still have authority to police any sort of anti-competitive things like that, of shutting out a competitor's progress. They would take a good look at deals that would have exclusive content providers with teaming up with transmitters, right? So if you have Comcast who says, "Hey, we're going to be your exclusive Netflix provider," the FTC would likely take a good hard look at that. Our next story, and if they're taking good hard looks at other things, they would certainly take a good hard look at that. So I don't see the problem. I guess my last analogy is look, if you're just going to talk general principles about creating things and treating them as utilities versus deregulating them and letting the market go. I did a little math, and this occurred to me over the Thanksgiving weekend. We had phone calls from friends and relatives across the country, and not once did anyone say, "Hurry up, it's long distance." You're old enough to remember that, right?
Sure, absolutely.
That, wow, this is a long distance call. Hurry up, quick! This is costing everyone money. This is a big deal. I ran the numbers on what it would cost to do our podcast, where we talk for between the setting up the show and all that, probably about 2 hours a week. In 1985, at 1985 rates, to do this at a phone call, it would cost us about $200 to make those phone calls, and now we're doing it more or less for free. And it's better quality. And, so to me, that's innovation. That's because the government said we're not going to treat, we're busting up the telephone monopolies, and there's going to be competition, and those companies are going to compete, in which they did. And they competed, and to the point where they created the world we live in now, where there's internet for everyone, broadband for everyone. So that's where I am, is that the track record for government regulation is that you get less innovation. I think let's put it this way. At least I can understand some arguments for and against net neutrality. What I don't understand is sort of the panic about it.
Sure.
the hyperactive reaction.
Sure. Well, I would say that you and I absolutely are in agreement on the importance of competition and what competition can do for consumers. There's no real dispute between us there. I think where we differ is in terms of how this is going to affect that, and is this actually better for innovation in the long run? And I say certainly no, and you say certainly yes. And one final thing before we move on, I know we've been on this story for a while, but I think it's an important story, the kind of policy thing we like to dig into, that this isn't just because the FCC might rule, well, they will rule to roll back these rules. It's still going to be that there's going to be a lawsuit. Sure. Multiple lawsuits. And the thing is, the Supreme Court has previously ruled that an agency has to examine the relevant data and articulate a satisfactory explanation for its action when it rolls back or changes rules. And some people might think, well, if you're an agency, you can just do what you want. And that's just not the case. Agencies are very constrained in many instances.
Well, I wouldn't say very
somewhat constrained. And so, but given that this is
the court will always give deference to the agency.
Right. But I would say that certainly there will be a big fight over this, and I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But this isn't going to be like all of a sudden, boom, sometime in mid-December, all of a sudden net neutrality is going away. There's going to be lawsuits. I would bet there might be injunctions. We'll see about that. But this definitely is a to be continued type of story for sure.
Well, and the last but not least, the other way to deal with this is, rather than having the unelected bureaucrats at the FCC make broad sweeping rules, is actually have elected representatives in Congress put together an internet policy.
Well, yeah, I think that would be ideal, assuming Congress could actually, do anything. But yeah. So yeah. All right. Well, let's move on. AT&T, they were obviously cheering the news coming out of the FCC about this. They weren't at all happy to learn that the Justice Department will be suing to block their $85.4 billion merger with Time Warner. Now, the move was,
the government giveth and the government taketh away.
There you go, and this was a bit of a surprise because you don't generally think of the Trump administration as opposing what big corporate interest wants. At least I don't. But more than that, I think, is the unusual nature of the Justice Department's action here, because the merger would be a so-called vertical merger, meaning a combination of companies that don't directly compete. And historically, while the government sometimes asks for certain concessions before approving big vertical mergers or saying that they're not going to challenge them, they don't sue to block them because they're not seen as strictly anti-competitive. But in this case, the Trump administration is arguing that the merger should be blocked because it would result in higher prices for consumers. So, Jay, what do you think?
Well, again, you always ask me what I think, and I should clarify to listeners. I try not just to put out what I think, but I guess what I think the conservative position is or ought to be. I guess that's a better way.
Good point. Yeah.
Which usually coincides with what I think. But
yeah.
What I'm saying is you shouldn't take this because, hey, this is what I think. It's because I am sort of transmitting the wisdom of a lot of other people who think the other way, and hopefully transmitting it well. Actually, I tend to be, and I think the conservative wisdom tends to be with you in saying that this is a really sort of a stretch for antitrust regulators. It would be breaking new ground. I would say, look, most conservatives, if you talk about, again, there's the idea of not having the government intervene too much in the economy, tend to be skeptical of FTC weighing in on who ought to merge and who ought not to merge. And this is particularly one of those cases. I think it's kind of far-fetched that there's going to be this real anti-competitive effect that is being pushed, and I worry about the precedent of the FTC getting more involved in vertical mergers, which tend to be a win-win for everybody most of the time. Now, there's arguments also that this is just sort of a animus from the Trump administration, that they don't like CNN and they want to stick it to Time Warner and so forth, and that's even more troubling to me as a conservative. I don't know how much of that is actually in there, because look, antitrust analysis, there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of stuff to figure out. And the people who put together this suit, I think, are necessarily thinking about it on a lot deeper level than, say, what Trump is. Regardless, I don't think there's a really strong antitrust case to be made against this merger.
Yeah, I don't buy the.
So I'm being consistent. Get the government out of net neutrality, get the government out of messing around with this merger, and let everybody sort it out themselves.
Yeah, I don't buy that. That Trump. I buy that Trump hates CNN, obviously, but I don't buy that had any role in it. To me, given the fact that almost everyone who knows something about antitrust law says that this is a very weak case, my sense is this is more of
I do.
Yeah, well, there you go. So I think this is much more of a negotiation tactic. They were pushing to get AT&T to sell off more assets maybe than AT&T was willing to do in the pre-lawsuit negotiations. And Justice Department folks have said, we're still open to some sort of a settlement. So I think this is just kind of pushing it a little more and kind of trying to get a better negotiating position for some sort of concessions from AT&T. But I don't think this is ultimately gonna wind up, being. I think it's gonna end up being settled. Is my prediction on this.
I think so too. But to me, it's still, problematic that the government sort of weighs in, sort of puts its hand on the finger on the scale a little bit in terms of reaching that settlement.
Odd for the Trump administration. This is the kind of thing you might expect. And weird thing. This is kind of a weird sort of flip flop. Back in 2011, when there was a similar deal in the works, Comcast wanted to acquire NBC Universal. The Obama administration gave its go ahead to that after they imposed, a few conditions on the transaction, a similar kind of thing, a vertical merger. And here you have, there you had a case of Democrats being okay, a Democratic administration being okay with big corporate merger. And here you have a Republican administration not being okay with it. So it's like we're in bizarro world a little bit here.
Well, I think this is another example of why, I say over and over again, Trump isn't a true conservative in the sense of he really has ever, given much thought to what it means to have smaller, less intrusive government and so forth. He likes what he likes and is sort of a pragmatist. And I don't exactly.
I wonder how much Donald Trump really had to do with this.
Right.
I don't see him getting deep into the weeds of antitrust law or anything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Now, again, if someone from the Justice Department perhaps briefed him and said, look, we've taken a look at this, which is that's their duty to do that. Federal Trade Commission is to take a look at that, and said, now there may be some concerns. We can't tell you for sure that this is a problem or that we'd win. I could see him pulling the trigger saying, let's get, that kind of thing. But obviously I think the initial analysis would have been done by, lawyers, very smart people, but sort of deep in the bowels of the FTC antitrust division.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly if you wanted the government to stop it, you would say to the president, President Obama approved a similar thing when he was president, and that would be a good way to go about it. But
that's how the conversation went. It could be more than.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Before we move on to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporter, Chris from Cypress, Texas. Chris writes, "Hey, Mike, Jay, and Trey, I really enjoy listening to the show throughout the week. It's great to listen to opposing viewpoints without all the shouting and other nonsense that's become so prevalent in political discussions. I'm also a fan of Mike's blog. I work in restaurant management, and I really found the most recent article about farm labor very relevant to my industry and the struggles we have with staffing our restaurant. Please keep up the great work." So thanks very much, Chris. We really appreciate that. We appreciate your support. It means a lot to us. And support of great listeners like Chris really helps us to keep the Politics Guys going. If you would like to join him and help out the show, go to I can say our web address, politicsguys.com, and click on the Patreon link. Okay, untie my tongue before we get to our next story. The string of unfavorable rulings against President Trump's executive actions continued this week. This time, though, it wasn't his immigration ban, but his order that would have discharged all transgender troops from the military and kept transgender people from enlisting.
Although I don't want to knock you off here, but
go ahead.
We should mention, because we didn't mention this last week.
Yep.
That the Ninth Circuit actually took some pretty big steps to reverse the Hawaii decision, which would have essentially affirmed a lot of the Trump new travel ban. We didn't get into that, but I'm just saying if we're keeping score of the scorecard.
Okay.
Yes, onto the transgender.
Right. I still think if we maybe could do a Trump injunction, executive order injunction scorecard, though I don't think it would look very good for the president ultimately. But anyway, in this case, the judge, Marvin Garbus of the Federal District Court for Maryland. Now he's a George H.W. Bush appointee back when there were occasionally moderate Republicans in the world, said that the order likely violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. And now this injunction follows one last month by another federal judge, but it goes further than that one because it also blocks the part of the order that prohibits the military for paying for gender reassignment surgery for troops. So, Jay, what are your thoughts on, well, first on this injunction, or what do you think the conservative sense is on this, and also where things might go from here?
Look, I think from the beginning, you and I both agreed that this was sort of a solution in search of a problem. That was and everything going on was the probability of transgender troops serving in our military really a big one. Even if it was, again, as you said, I mean, the administration and the military has pretty wide latitude in determining how to run its own house. But it's got to show that it's got some substantial rational reasons for doing so. And I don't think there was any such showing made in this case. This is kind of policy by tweet, where he tweeted this out, one morning, and much to the surprise of the Joint Chiefs and everyone else who might have had a say in this. So again, this is sort of a fight he started without being ready for it and for no good reason. So I very much I think the courts have gotten it right so far. There may be a way to fix it. Much as they did with the immigration, you go back, you make findings, you issue another order. But that gets to the larger question of why. I mean,
it's a battle that just doesn't make any sense from a strategic standpoint, from a fact standpoint. It just seems one of those bizarre Trump things that leaves most people scratching their heads, I think. And I'm one of them, certainly. But I agree with you that the courts have gotten it right. And based on the law, on the facts, on everything, it just seems like a pointless sort of thing to do. And I expect that this is an executive order that ultimately will not end up going into effect for some very good reasons.
Well, and especially when we have a national policy that allows homosexuals to serve in the military, and the definition of transgender. Well, this is sort of a conservative gripe. A lot of times is that it sort of means a whole lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it always seems to be sort of shifting. But my sense is that homosexuality sort of encompasses a lot of transgenderism and vice versa. So we've already sort of been here and done that.
I was going to say kind of a broader point, and one of the frustrating things or difficult things I would say about legislating in this area is it's always, I think, more difficult to legislate or put in place regulations when you're dealing with sort of fluid things. And the more we learn about, I think, human sexuality, the more we find that it's not really a series of, for many people at least, of binary categories, but it's oftentimes a somewhat more fluid continuum. And that makes it a lot trickier to write good regulations and good laws. And so that's a real problem for policymakers, I think.
Right. And all the more reason to me why, unless there's some good reason that we're hearing from the military of this is a problem with, unit cohesion was the argument that used to be made, or troop morale or just other whatever problems in governing the military, making the military less effective. then it's something that we just ought to stay out of. And if someone wants to serve their country, then God bless them.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, let's move on to our last story for today. We talked about it last week, and kind of as we expected, I think I guess I'll call it the sad and tragic sort of saga of sexual harassment continued on this week. I mean, first there was that revelation that in 2015, Democratic Representative John Conyers settled a wrongful termination lawsuit against the staffer he allegedly sexually harassed. And Democratic House Leader Nancy Pelosi responded by calling for an ethics committee investigation. And Conyers admits the settlement, but denies the claims of harassment. And then there were also claims from several more women who accused Senator Al Franken of groping them during photo ops. And Franken says he doesn't remember the incidents, but he apologized if the women felt disrespected, which they obviously did. Now, in a recent poll of Minnesotans, 33% said Franken should resign, while 36% he should wait for the results of a Senate Ethics Committee investigation before making any kind of decision on that. And finally, President Trump gave what some people are calling an endorsement. I call it more of kind of a boost to Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore, who, of course, is accused of multiple instances of inappropriate behavior, some with underage women, while he was in his 30s. And again, it wasn't an official endorsement. Trump placed emphasis on Moore's denials of the allegations, as well as expressing skepticism about claims from so long ago coming to light only now. So, Jay, well, what do you think about that? Do you think we're going to see more coming out of Congress? And do you think that these revelations are kind of rise to the same level as the earlier things, or what?
Well, we're seeing just a lot of weirdness. This is Peggy Noonan had a really good piece just commenting on how the allegations that we're hearing it's coming to the front because it's a little weirder. It's more prurient, I guess, than what the I don't know. It sort of you think of like let's call it classic sexual harassment. It's sort of you think back to like Mad Men kind of days. You know what I mean? It's Don Draper hitting on his secretary and that sort of thing. This is sort of the open robe and I'm having a meeting in my shower. That sort of thing where again. To me, who does this? But apparently a lot of people. Anyway, that's just my little editorial commentary.
No, absolutely.
But no, I think there's more to come, and there's a big push now to open up all of these congressional records to who was paid and why. That's going to become perhaps irresistible, before we get to Christmas and more of these stories come out. And the stories are all different. There was a Republican congressman, and his name escapes me, from Texas.
Joe Barton. Yeah.
Joe Barton. Yeah. Well, Joe made some bad choices.
Oh God, I'll say so. I heard. Now, thankfully I haven't seen it, but apparently he either taped or allowed himself to be taped in a video masturbating. And that to me is, you got to say, if you are a member of Congress, and who wants to see that? And who would think that, yes, this would be this to me is just the primary example of how you can be the smartest person in the world and sex makes some awfully smart people awfully stupid, because wow, that's about as dumb as it gets, it's just mind boggling to me. So
and that to me again is more just again the weirdness of this whole thing. Now Barton, I think there hasn't been any actual complaint that what Barton did was non-consensual,
right.
But
just gross and creepy, I guess. What people would say.
It's just really unusual. It was kind of like remember the guy in the tiger suit a couple years ago?
The guy in the tiger suit.
The tiger suit, yeah.
That sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't recall now.
He was a Democrat from California, and he had like that was his deal was like, he was sexually turned on by like dressing up like animals and so forth.
Oh, geez. Okay, yeah, I've heard something about this.
We'll find it.
Sure.
We'll find it, but it's important news. But no, I think, I think there's more to come. And we'll sort of see where people stand. Now, again, Trump is, as usual, I think, sort of botching this. Why does he need to sort of make any statements about Roy Moore? Ivanka actually made some sort of pretty damning statements against Roy Moore. And I think he's just falling into the usual competitive trap of if somebody says something, he's going to say something back. So no, I don't. I agree. It's sort of a non-endorsement, and he'd actually be in a better position if he just said nothing about it. And likewise with the Franken situation, if you're a thinking about overall grand Republican strategy, again, this is going to be me being Machiavellian. I absolutely do not want Al Franken to resign. You want him right there where you can see him. From a strategy point, would if there were a special election, would the Republicans be likely to pick up the Minnesota Senate seat? Doubtful. Would there probably be a goofy primary that you'd all spend money on? Yes. Now again, there's some argument of, hey, we're spreading the field, and that would be another race they'd have to defend and so forth. But I think that the downside outweighs. I think Al Franken at this point is kind of neutralized.
Right.
Right. Well, I mean, his big was sort of a fundraiser for a lot of these candidates, and I think that's been taken away now. Yeah.
And, there was some talk after his book came out about, maybe Al Franken is the future of the party, and maybe there's a presidential run in the future. And I won't rule out anything, certainly, given the sexual history of the man who's currently in the Oval Office. But that seems to be a little less likely, I would say, than it was a few months ago. So. But yeah, I agree with you. There's more to come, and that's a good thing. And more of this should come out. All right. It is time for What We're Reading, where we step back from the news cycle and talk about the more in-depth, kind of thoughtful things we're reading, listening to, or watching. And today, I have kind of a very policy wonkish sort of thing. It's a great article. This is going to sound weird. Probably people would never put this together. A great article about the chain CPI. That sounds like those two things don't go together. Now,
wow.
Yeah, okay. Chain CPI is a hugely important thing. What chain CPI is, it's another way of calculating inflation, basically. It's a different way of calculating inflation from...
And by CPI, you mean Consumer Price Index.
Yes, thank you. Yes. From the standard way. And it is important right now because many Republicans, in fact, in the Republican tax bills, they want to switch inflation calculations from regular CPI to chain CPI. And what that would have the effect of doing is it would, since chain CPI tends to be a lower inflation figure, generally speaking, that would mean that it would be essentially a stealth tax raise. It would boost people up into further tax brackets or higher tax brackets over time more quickly than using regular CPI. And kind of a weird little historical note, tax brackets did not used to be linked to inflation in any way. But one of the things that President Reagan did when he came into office and they did a tax reform was to actually link tax brackets to inflation. And so that only started in the 1980s. But now in the Republican bills, they actually want to change the inflation indicator that they're linked to. And this article is really fascinating, at least if you're at all interested in policy things. It talks about the differences between regular CPI and chain CPI, how it's calculated in the first place, which one's more accurate, and if we can even accurately calculate inflation as a general thing. Anyway, if you like this kind of thing, you'll love this. If you don't like this kind of thing, well, you won't like it at all. But I think it's a really great read. Yeah, absolutely. So do you have...
I think that... No, I think that sounds good because, again, something that always has concerned me is the idea of bracket creep. And that's what sort of happens here. And again, CPI, when we're talking about inflation, because different industries move at different paces, you can see rapid deflation in one and hyperinflation, probably hyperinflation, but sort of much larger. And it depends on what you're into. I mean, look, if you're someone who has kids going to college or you need a lot of medical care, then you're certainly seeing a different real CPI for you than what the average person would see. So
yeah, absolutely. All right, do you have anything for us today?
So yeah, from me, and this is sort of the opposite of yours. Yours is like the hyper wonkish. Mine is sort of big picture, inspirational, because I was accused of being too
Machiavellian.
I guess too Machiavellian, too much of a realist. Every year since 1961, the Wall Street Journal Journal has published 2 editorials on Thanksgiving Day. The first being called In the Desolate Wilderness, and the second being In the Fair Land. And In the Desolate Wilderness is a excerpt from the journal of one of the Mayflower voyagers. And really, it's one of these things that just to get some sense of perspective of what life was like in 1620 versus what life is like now, and what we do have to be thankful for and grateful for. Really, if you think about the Pilgrim story, it's incredible. I mean, they left one country, they stayed another. They left friends and family knowing that they would never see them again.
The original immigrants.
This isn't a situation where the original immigrants. And they were willing to do this based on because they wanted to practice their religion as they saw fit and have some degree of self-governance that they didn't have in England. And it's just, if you think about it, I mean, how many people would be willing to make that type of commitment today? But there still are those people, and then again, that's even bigger, because you think, there are people who leave everything behind, knowing that they can never go back, knowing that they may die in the process. And in fact, over half of the pilgrims did die, and they still stuck it out. So I mean, I think if you read that and what they were up against, and the perseverance and the belief and the faith, because again, faith is something, and I don't even necessarily mean this in a religious sense. They obviously did, but the idea that look, what you're doing is the right thing and is going to accomplish something at the end of the day. That's just really difficult to would have been really difficult to keep up under the circumstances that they had. And then the Fair Land, which is the piece that sort of accompanies it, is just sort of about all the greatness and potential of America. And look, I think it's worth going back and checking these out. Again, they publish them every year, and they have published them every year since 1961. But that's my sort of bigger picture, put some perspective on things piece for this week.
All right. And as always, we'll have links to those in the show notes and on the website. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you like what you heard. And if ad-free episodes like this one are what you prefer, we hope you'll consider joining our great group of Politics Guys sustaining supporters by going to politicsguys.com and clicking on the Patreon link. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share this episode with your friends and followers, or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter, and leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also does help. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.